Welcome to Crossdressing Stories. Here, we share personal stories, celebrate self-expression. If you're on your own journey or simply curious, you've found your community. Subscribe and join the conversation.
David Weatherby's world had shrunk, but he didn't mind. After 40 years of teaching high school history, of commanding classrooms with his steady baritone voice, and the faint scent of chalk dust on his tweed jacket, his life had become a quiet, predictable rhythm. He was 62, a recent widower, and his days were measured by the slow ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall and the methodical progress of the World War II biography he was reading. His house, once filled with the warm, vibrant chaos of his wife, Helen, and their daughter, Sarah, was now a silent monument to his past. He still kept Helen's art studio upstairs exactly as she had left it, the easel holding an unfinished watercolor, the scent of her oil paints still lingering in the air. His only real connection to the frantic, modern world was Sarah. She was a shooting star, a brilliant, fiercely ambitious fashion designer who had clawed her way from a small-town scholarship to a coveted spot in the Paris fashion scene. He didn't understand her world of haute couture, of fabrics that cost more than his monthly mortgage had, but he understood her passion. It was the same fire Helen had possessed. He was sitting in his worn leather armchair, a cup of lukewarm tea at his elbow, when his phone buzzed with an international call. It was Sarah. He smiled, expecting her usual cheerful, slightly breathless update. Instead, the voice that came through the speaker was choked with frantic, tearful panic. "Dad? Dad, I need you. I need you to get on a plane. Now." "Sarah? What is it? What's wrong?" he asked, his heart lurching with a sudden, cold fear. "It's a disaster," she sobbed, her voice a torrent of panicked French and English. "Everything is ruined. My show, it's in 2 days. The biggest moment of my entire life, and it's all falling apart. Dad, please. I know it's insane, I know it's a lot to ask, but I need you here. I have no one else." He didn't hesitate. The quiet life could wait. His daughter needed him. "I'm on my way," he said, his old, authoritative teacher's voice returning. "Just tell me what I need to do." 24 hours later, after a sleepless, turbulent flight, David found himself standing in a world that felt like a different planet. Sarah's apartment in Paris was a sprawling, achingly chic loft in Le Marais, but it was currently in a state of beautiful, high-stakes chaos. Bolts of luxurious fabric were draped over every surface, sketches were taped to the walls, and a small, harried team of assistants and seamstresses were buzzing around like bees in a threatened hive. Sarah, her eyes red-rimmed and shadowed with exhaustion, threw her arms around him. "You came," she whispered, her voice a mixture of relief and despair. "Of course I did," he said, holding her tight. "Now, tell me what's happened." Slowly. The story came out in a rush. Sarah's collection, titled Androgyny's Muse, was a highly anticipated showcase at Paris Fashion Week. Her concept was a fluid, gender-bending exploration of modern identity. The problem was her models. A rival designer, a notoriously vindictive man named Antoine Dubois, had poached her 2 lead male models at the last minute, leaving her with a gaping hole in her runway show. But that wasn't the worst of it. "My star," Sarah said, her voice cracking. "My final look, the centerpiece of the whole collection, was meant for Anya Petrova." Anya Petrova was a famous, ethereally beautiful androgynous model, a legend in the industry. "She was my muse, the inspiration for everything. And she just called. Her mother is gravely ill in Moscow. She's on a plane home. She's gone." David, a man who thought of fashion in terms of durable fabrics and sensible shoes, was struggling to grasp the scale of the catastrophe. "Can't you just hire someone else?" Sarah let out a harsh, desperate laugh. "Dad, this is Paris Fashion Week. You can't just hire someone 2 days before a show. Not for a final look. Everyone is booked. Everyone. And no one has Anya's presence." She gestured wildly at a mannequin in the corner. "That dress was made for her. It needs a certain maturity, a grace, a tall, slender frame. It needs a story behind the eyes. I'm ruined." She sank onto a stool, burying her face in her hands. I've worked my whole life for this. I poured every cent I had, every bit of my soul, into this collection. It's over. David looked from his distraught daughter to the dress on the mannequin. It was a stunning, almost sculptural creation of flowing, dark green silk that seemed to shimmer even in the dim light. It was elegant, powerful, and strangely timeless. He then looked at his own reflection in a large mirror leaning against the wall. He saw a tired, grieving history teacher. But he also saw what Sarah needed. A tall, slender frame. And a story behind the eyes. An idea so insane, so utterly preposterous that he almost dismissed it out of hand, began to form in his mind. It was a mad gamble, but what other choice did they have? He thought of his wife, Helen, of her fearless, artistic spirit. What would she have done? He walked over to Sarah and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. Maybe it's not over, he said softly. Show me the dress. Show me what Anya was supposed to do. Sarah looked up, her eyes wide with confusion. What? Dad, what are you talking about? Just show me, he insisted, his voice calm and steady. She led him over to the mannequin. Up close, the dress was even more magnificent. It was a masterclass in drapery, the dark green silk cascading from the shoulders in a way that was both powerful and graceful. It had long, flowing sleeves, a high, elegant neckline, and a cut that was surprisingly modest yet incredibly dramatic. The whole collection plays with the line between masculine and feminine, Sarah explained, her designer's passion momentarily overriding her despair. The fabrics are soft, but the silhouettes are strong. This piece, it was meant to be the final statement. It's not a man's garment, it's not a woman's garment. It's just a form. It needs to be worn by someone who understands presence, who can command a room without shouting. David listened, his gaze fixed on the dress. He was 6 feet 2 inches, and a lifetime of standing in front of classrooms had given him a naturally straight, authoritative posture. He was slender, having lost weight in the months since Helen's passing. He looked at his own long, slightly stooped frame in the mirror again. What if the Muse wasn't a young model? He said slowly, thinking out loud. What if the Muse was history? Something timeless. Something with a bit of gravitas. Sarah was still staring at him, utterly lost. Dad, I don't have time for metaphors. I need a person. He took a deep breath. The words felt absurd on his tongue. Sarah, he said, turning to face her, his expression completely serious. What if I did it? For a moment, there was complete silence in the bustling studio. One of the young assistants dropped a pin, and the tiny sound echoed in the sudden quiet. Then, Sarah blinked. Did what? Wear the dress, he said, the words gaining a strange momentum now that they were out. Walk in your show. Be your final look. Sarah just stared at him, her mouth slightly agape. The idea was so far outside the realm of possibility that her brain couldn't seem to process it. She looked at her father, her kind, gentle, tweed-wearing history teacher father, and then back at the high-fashion silk gown. The two images were so violently discordant that it was almost comical. A hysterical giggle escaped her lips. Dad, you're not serious. You can't be. Why not? He challenged, a spark of something he hadn't felt in years igniting within him. It was the same stubborn determination he used to feel when a student said they couldn't understand a concept. You said you need a tall, slender frame. I have that. You said you need a story behind the eyes. God knows I have that. You said it's not a man's or a woman's garment. So what does it matter who wears it? The assistants were now openly staring, their work forgotten. Sarah looked around the room, her eyes darting from her father to her team, her expression a wild mix of desperation and dawning, horrified consideration. It was an insane, career-ending, ludicrous idea. It was a stunt. It would make her a laughingstock. But what other choice did she have? Her show was in 48 hours. Her centerpiece was gone. Her dream was turning to dust. And standing in front of her was her father, offering the most ridiculous, selfless, and utterly insane lifeline imaginable. It wouldn't work, she whispered, more to herself than to him. The walk, the face, the... Teach me, he said simply. You have 48 hours. I'm a quick study. I taught teenagers about the Napoleonic Wars for 40 years. I think I can learn to walk in a straight line. Sarah stared at her father, a storm of conflicting emotions warring within her. Logic, training, and every instinct she had as a designer told her this was a terrible, catastrophic idea. But the look in her father's eyes, a steady, quiet resolve she hadn't seen in years, held a strange, compelling power. The desperation of her situation was a tide, pulling her toward this insane, last-ditch solution. "All right," she said, the word coming out as a breathy, uncertain whisper. The entire studio seemed to exhale with her. "Okay, let's see." The first step was to see if the dress would even fit. Sarah and her lead seamstress, a formidable older woman named Cosette, carefully lifted the precious silk gown off the mannequin. "Take off your jacket and shirt, Dad," Sarah instructed, her voice now shifting into its professional, slightly detached designer tone. David did as he was told, standing in the middle of the brightly lit studio in his undershirt and trousers. He felt a dozen pairs of young, critical eyes on him, and a hot flush of self-consciousness crept up his neck. Cosette circled him, her lips pursed, taking in his bony shoulders and the slight, professorial stoop of his back. "The shoulders are about right," Cosette declared in French, her tone surprisingly neutral. "The length will need adjusting. But the frame, it is not impossible." They carefully slipped the dress over his head. The silk was cool and impossibly light against his skin. It felt like being draped in water. The dress settled over his frame, the heavy fabric falling in elegant columns to the floor, pooling around his sensible leather shoes. He stood awkwardly, his arms held stiffly at his sides, as Sarah and Cosette walked around him, pinning and adjusting. "Stand up straight, Dad," Sarah said, her hands gently pushing his shoulders back. "Own the space." He straightened his posture, and the effect was immediate. The dress, designed for a model's confident frame, suddenly fell into place. The high neckline framed his long, thin neck, and the flowing sleeves disguised the wiry muscle of his arms. He looked in the mirror. The image was jarring, bizarre. He saw the familiar, weathered face of a 62-year-old history teacher emerging from a column of exquisite dark green silk. It was absurd. But, as Cosette had said, it was not impossible. "The foundation is there," Sarah said, a flicker of something, not quite hope, but a frantic, creative energy igniting in her eyes. "But the rest, we have to strip everything else away." The next few hours were a methodical deconstruction of David Weatherby. He was seated in a chair in front of a portable makeup station, a bright ring light making him squint. A young, talented makeup artist named Jean-Luc was given his instructions by Sarah. "I don't want to make him look like a woman," Sarah explained, her voice rapid and precise. "That's not the point. The point is to create a canvas. Neutral. Timeless. Erase the gender, erase the age. I want you to find the bone structure." Jean-Luc went to work. David's face was cleansed and moisturized until his skin felt strangely slick. A lightweight foundation was applied, not to hide his wrinkles, but to even out the sunspots and reddish tones, creating a smooth, pale palette. His eyebrows, thick and unruly, were trimmed and subtly shaped, defining the arch over his eyes. A light, neutral powder set the foundation, removing all shine. There was no blush, no eyeliner, no lipstick. The effect was strange and powerful. His face, stripped of its familiar, weathered details, became a study in planes and angles. The lines around his eyes and mouth now looked less like signs of age and more like etchings on a stone sculpture. Finally, his hair. His neat, graying professor's haircut was wetted down and slicked back from his face, revealing the shape of his skull and his high forehead. The severity of the style further emphasized his bone structure. When they were done, Sarah had him stand in front of the full-length mirror again. He was still wearing the dress. He looked at his reflection. The man he knew was gone. The person in the mirror was someone else entirely. It was an androgynous, almost ageless figure, with a face that was neither masculine nor feminine, but simply human. The story behind the eyes that Sarah had talked about was now the only discernible feature. "Okay," Sarah said, her voice filled with a new, terrifying resolve. "The canvas is blank. Now, I have to teach you how to walk. David had been walking for 62 years. He had walked the quiet, tree-lined streets of his town, the echoing halls of his high school, the rugged trails of national parks. He had never once thought about how he walked. It was simply a means of getting from one point to another. He was about to learn that on a runway, walking was not a means to an end. It was the entire story. Sarah cleared a long, straight path through the center of the chaotic studio. "This is your runway," she declared. "From that wall to this one. That's all you have to do. Walk." For this first lesson, he wasn't wearing the precious silk gown. Instead, he was in a simple, long practice garment and, most terrifyingly, the shoes. They weren't high heels, a mercy for which he was profoundly grateful. But they were a far cry from his comfortable brogues. They were a pair of flat, minimalist leather boots with a thin, hard sole that offered no support whatsoever. They forced him to be aware of every single step. "Okay, Dad," Sarah said, her tone all business. "Just walk to the other end." David took a breath and started walking. He moved as he always had, a steady, slightly shuffling gait, his shoulders a little stooped, his eyes on his destination. "Stop!" Sarah cried out, her voice sharp. "Stop. What was that?" "I was walking," he said, confused. "No," she said, shaking her head. "You were commuting. You looked like you were trying to catch a bus. This is not about getting somewhere. It's about the journey. Every step is a statement." She came and stood beside him. "Your shoulders are hunched. You're leading with your head. On a runway, you lead with your hips. It's your center of gravity. It's where the power comes from." She made him place his hands on his hips. "Feel that? That's your anchor. Now, when you walk, I want you to imagine you are pushing forward from this point, not pulling yourself along with your shoulders." He tried again. He focused on the feeling of his hips, trying to initiate the movement from his core. The result was a stiff, awkward, and completely unnatural lurching motion. One of the young assistants stifled a giggle. "Okay, no," Sarah said, pinching the bridge of her nose. "Forget the hips. Let's try another approach. Forget fashion. Think about history. That's your world, right?" He nodded. "Okay," she said, her eyes lighting up with a new idea. "Don't be a model. Be a character. When you walk out on that runway, you're not just a person in a dress. You are a Roman senator, walking into the forum. You are a king, pacing the length of his throne room. You are a general, surveying the battlefield before the dawn. Think of that. The weight, the purpose, the history in every single step." Something clicked. He could understand that. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the chaotic studio fade away. He thought of the historical figures he had spent his life studying. He thought of their portraits, their bearing, the quiet, unshakable authority they projected. He opened his eyes. He straightened his back, not because Sarah told him to, but because he was channeling the posture of Marcus Aurelius. He looked towards the far wall, not as a destination, but as his domain. He took his first step. It was slower, more deliberate. He let his foot land with a quiet certainty. He didn't swing his arms. He let them hang naturally at his sides. He wasn't lurching. He was proceeding. There was a rhythm to it, a slow, steady, and powerful cadence. He reached the other end of the studio and turned. The entire room was silent. Sarah was staring at him, her mouth slightly open, her eyes wide with a look of pure, unadulterated shock. "Dad," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. How did you do that?" He gave a small, weary smile. "I've had a lot of practice," he said. "History is just one long walk, after all." The walk was the foundation, but Sarah, a designer obsessed with detail, knew the illusion was built on 1,000 tiny, almost imperceptible elements. With the walk unlocked, she and her team now had less than 36 hours to deconstruct David and rebuild him, piece by tiny piece. The lessons became a rapid-fire series of corrections and adjustments, turning the chaotic studio into an intense, surreal finishing school. First came the hands. "What are you doing with your hands, Dad?" Sarah asked as he completed another practice walk. "They look like they're searching for something to build or fix." His hands, she explained, had to be part of the silent narrative. They couldn't be clenched, nor could they be limp. They needed a state of restful intention. Cosette, the lead seamstress, showed him. She let her own aged, nimble hands fall to her sides, her fingers gently curved, not touching but held in a state of soft, relaxed readiness. "They are not tools," she said in her thick French accent. "They are punctuation." He spent the next hour just walking, his entire focus on letting his hands become punctuation. Next were the eyes. "You're looking at things," Sarah said, frustrated. "The audience, the lights, the end of the runway." "A muse doesn't look at things. A muse looks through them. Your gaze should be distant, unfocused. You are in your own world, and we are just visitors looking in." To practice, she made him stare at a blank white wall while she and her assistants waved their hands and tried to distract him. He had to learn to see without seeing, to project an inner world that was far more compelling than the physical world around him. He drew on his years as a teacher, perfecting the calm, unseeing gaze he used when waiting for a noisy classroom to settle down. Then came the turn. At the end of the runway, a model had to turn and walk back. David's first attempt was a practical, shuffling pivot, the kind one makes in a narrow grocery store aisle. "No, no, no," Sarah cried out, burying her face in her hands. "It has to be fluid." It's the period at the end of the sentence. A young, lithe choreographer who had been brought in to help with the other models took him aside. "Do not think of it as a turn," the young man said. "Think of it as a continuation. The energy does not stop." He showed David how to pause for a single, dramatic beat, allowing the flowing fabric of the practice garment to settle. Then, how to turn his head first, his eyes leading the way, and allow his body to follow in a single, seamless, unhurried motion. It was less a turn and more an unwinding. David practiced it over and over, the simple motion feeling more complex than any historical timeline he had ever memorized. Even the way he stood was dissected. "You're standing like you're waiting for a train," Sarah critiqued. "There is no tension." She adjusted his posture, shifting his weight slightly onto one hip, a classic model's pose called contrapposto. The subtle shift was transformative, instantly making his stance look less rigid and more graceful, allowing the practice dress to drape more elegantly. He was a history teacher. He understood the accumulation of small details, how tiny, seemingly insignificant events could build up to change the course of empires. Now, his own body was the empire, and his daughter was the relentless historian, reshaping him with every small, critical observation. He was no longer learning to be a model. He was learning the intricate, unspoken language of a completely different kind of person. The atmosphere in Sarah's atelier had transformed. The initial shock and quiet giggles that had greeted David's involvement had evaporated, replaced by a tense, focused, and slightly awestruck energy. The team, a mix of young, ambitious interns and seasoned, cynical artisans, had never seen anything like it. They watched as this quiet, elderly man, this pair, submitted himself to the grueling process with a stoic patience that was both humbling and profoundly moving. He never complained about the endless repetitions of the walk. He listened intently to every instruction, his brow furrowed in concentration as he tried to master the subtle shift of weight in the turn. Cosette and her team of seamstresses worked around the clock, meticulously tailoring the final silk gown to David's frame. They worked in a hushed reverence, their needles flying as they adjusted the hem and subtly reinforced the drape over the shoulders. His posture, Cosette remarked in a low voice to another seamstress as they worked. "It is not a model's posture. It is something else. It has weight. It is sad, but it is strong." The young interns, who had at first seen him as a joke, a desperate stunt, now watched him with a kind of cult-like devotion. They would stop their own work to watch his practice walks, whispering to each other. "Did you see that last turn? It was so poetic. It's his eyes. He looks like he has seen everything." David was largely oblivious to the whispers. He was in his own world, a world of intense focus. He was a student again, cramming for the most important exam of his life. The physical toll was immense. His feet ached from the thin-soled boots. His back, forced into a new, ramrod-straight posture, was in a constant state of protest. He was exhausted, running on adrenaline and lukewarm coffee. But something else was happening too. In the process of being deconstructed, he was discovering muscles he didn't know he had, a level of physical control he had never thought to access. The quiet, inward focus was a strange kind of meditation. Stripped of his familiar identity, he was becoming more aware of his own physical presence in a way he hadn't been in decades. One afternoon, during a brief break, he caught his reflection in the mirror. He was standing in the contrapposto pose, a habit he had already unconsciously adopted. His face was neutral, his hair was slicked back, and he was wearing a simple practice garment. For a split second, the stranger in the mirror didn't look tired or sad. He looked powerful. It was a fleeting, disorienting sensation, but it lingered. The story of the professor, as the team had started calling him, began to leak out. A makeup artist whispered to a friend at another fashion house. A fabric supplier saw him through the window. The notoriously gossipy Parisian fashion scene was starting to buzz with a strange, unbelievable rumor about Sarah Weatherby's upcoming show. Was she having a breakdown? Was it a publicity stunt? Or was she about to do something either career-endingly stupid or paradigm-shiftingly brilliant? Inside the atelier, insulated from the outside world, the team didn't care about the rumors. They had a singular focus: the show. They were no longer just employees working for a designer. They were acolytes, disciples of this strange, beautiful, and utterly insane project. They were all in this together, bound by a shared secret and the quiet, dignified grace of the history teacher who was trying to learn how to walk. The night before the show was the full dress rehearsal. The atmosphere in the studio was electric, a humming, high-voltage wire of anxiety and anticipation. This was the first time all the elements would come together: the final, tailored gown, the finished makeup, the walk, the music, the lighting. David stood in a curtained-off corner of the studio as Cosette and Sarah performed the final dressing. It was a hushed, ceremonial process. The dark green silk felt different now, heavier, imbued with the weight of 100 hours of meticulous work and a million hopes. It slid over his skin, the familiar feel now a second skin. Cosette made the final adjustments, her movements precise and reverent. Then came Jean-Luc for the final makeup application. It was the same neutral, sculptural look, but rendered with an even greater, almost invisible artistry. Every line on his face was not hidden, but defined. He looked less like a man wearing makeup and more like a being carved from pale stone. Finally, Sarah stood before him. She held a pair of simple, dark green leather boots, the ones he would wear on the runway. They were the same style as the practice boots, but made of a softer, more supple leather. "The last piece of the puzzle," she whispered, her hands trembling slightly as she helped him put them on. When he was ready, he stepped out from behind the curtain. The entire team, the seamstresses, the interns, the choreographer, the lighting tech, was gathered in the main studio space. A single spotlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the makeshift runway path. The powerful, atmospheric music Sarah had chosen for her finale began to play, a slow, haunting cello piece. Everyone held their breath. David walked from the darkness into the light. He was no longer David Weatherby, the history teacher. He was the character he and Sarah had created, a figure of timeless grace and profound, weary strength. He walked with the slow, deliberate, and powerful gait of a king, his gaze fixed on a point beyond the mortal world. The green silk flowed around him, a river of dark emerald in the stark light. He reached the end of the runway. He paused for that single, dramatic beat. He turned his head, his eyes leading the way, and his body followed in that slow, seamless, unwinding motion. The silk of the gown swirled around him, a final, breathtaking punctuation mark. He walked back and disappeared into the darkness. For a long moment after the music faded, there was absolute silence. Then someone started to clap. It was Cosette, her weathered face streaked with tears. Then Jean-Luc started clapping. Then the interns, their young faces filled with a look of pure adoration. Within seconds, the entire studio had erupted in a storm of applause, cheers, and emotional, cathartic sobs. Sarah was standing in the middle of it all. tears streaming down her face, not of despair, but of a fierce, overwhelming pride and a love for her father so profound it left her breathless. He had done it. He had become her muse. The insane, desperate idea had transformed into something powerful, something beautiful, something true. David walked back into the light, his face still the calm, neutral mask of his runway persona. He looked at his daughter, at her tear-streaked, triumphant face, and for the first time, he allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible smile. The rehearsal was over. Now, all that was left was the show itself, the backstage area of a Paris Fashion Week show, David quickly discovered, was a highly organized form of apocalyptic chaos. It was a cramped, labyrinthine space, buzzing with a frantic, almost violent energy. Models, impossibly tall and thin, rushed by in various states of undress. Hairstylists wielded cans of hairspray like weapons. Dressers shouted instructions in a flurry of different languages. In the midst of this maelstrom, Sarah had carved out a small, serene island of calm for her father. He had his own private dressing area, shielded by a black curtain. He was already in the early stages of his transformation, his hair slicked back, his face a pale, clean canvas. He sat quietly on a stool, a cup of tea in his hands, observing the beautiful chaos with the detached curiosity of a historian watching a pivotal, albeit very strange, battle. Sarah was a whirlwind of focused energy, a general commanding her troops. She moved through the chaos, making last-minute adjustments to a hemline, giving a final, encouraging word to a nervous model, her voice sharp and clear above the din. David watched her with a quiet pride. This was her world, and she was its master. 30 minutes before the show was due to start, the first whispers of the rumor he had been insulated from reached him. A famous fashion blogger, a woman with bright pink hair and a predatory smile, poked her head into the backstage area. Her eyes scanned the room, and then she saw him. Her eyes widened, and a look of pure, unadulterated shock crossed her face before she was shooed away by a security guard. A few minutes later, another journalist tried to sneak in. The buzz of gossip outside was clearly reaching a fever pitch. Sarah came into his curtained-off area, her face flushed with adrenaline. "Don't listen to anything out there," she said, her voice low and intense. "The rumors are flying. Everyone thinks I'm either a madwoman or a genius. There is no in-between. Just focus on what we practiced. You are the calm in the center of the storm." He nodded, taking a slow sip of his tea. Strangely, he felt no fear. He had faced down rooms of unruly teenagers for 40 years. He had held his wife's hand as she passed away. A runway full of fashion critics held no terror for him. This wasn't his world to lose. He was only here for his daughter. Jean-Luc arrived to apply the final makeup. His hands were as steady as a surgeon's, his focus absolute. As he worked, David could hear the sounds from the front of the house beginning to filter in, the low throb of the pre-show music, the murmur of hundreds of voices as the audience took their seats. Finally, it was time for the dress. Sarah and Cosette came in, their faces solemn. The final ritual began. The green silk was carefully slipped over his head. The boots were laced. He stood up, the familiar weight of the gown settling around him. Sarah stood in front of him, making a final, tiny adjustment to the drape on his shoulder. She looked up at him, her eyes bright with a mixture of fear and love. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Whatever happens out there, thank you." He reached out and gently touched her cheek, a gesture that was all father, not Muse. "Break a leg, kiddo," he said, his voice his own. Then, he let his face settle into the calm, distant mask of his persona. He stepped out of the curtained area. The show was about to begin. The final look was ready. David stood in the wings, shrouded in darkness. He could hear the show beginning, the music swelling, and the rhythmic, powerful stomp of the first model hitting the runway. He was the final look, number 16. He had to wait, to stand perfectly still in the darkness, until it was his turn. He watched the other models on a small monitor. They were impossibly young, fierce, and beautiful, showcasing Sarah's collection with a professional, practiced swagger. The clothes were magnificent, a bold, elegant fusion of masculine tailoring and feminine fabrics. The crowd's reaction, from what he could discern, was positive. There was a low, appreciative murmur. But as the show progressed, a new sound began to ripple through the audience. It was the buzz of whispers. The rumors from backstage were clearly spreading through the rows. People were looking at their phones, whispering behind their hands. The anticipation in the room was shifting from the clothes to something else entirely. They were waiting for the punchline, the gimmick, the rumored old man who was supposedly in the show. Finally, model number 15 completed her walk. A stagehand gave David a nervous, wide-eyed look. "You're on," he mouthed. The haunting cello music for the finale began to swell. A single, brilliant white spotlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the entrance to the runway. This was it. David didn't think about the audience. He didn't think about the critics, the cameras, or the whispers. He thought about Marcus Aurelius. He thought about the weight of history. He thought about his wife, Helen, and the fierce pride she would have felt. He thought about his daughter, watching from the wings, her entire future resting on his shoulders. He stepped from the darkness into the light. A sound, a collective, audible gasp, swept through the entire auditorium. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated shock. The whispers stopped. The phones were lowered. Every single person in the room was frozen, their attention utterly and completely captivated by the figure on the runway. They had been expecting a joke, a clumsy old man in a dress. What they saw was something else entirely. They saw a figure of impossible, unexpected grace. A being who was neither male nor female, young nor old. They saw the exquisite dark green silk gown, moving like liquid around a frame that wore it not as a costume, but as a second skin. They saw a walk that was not a strut, but a procession. It was slow, deliberate, and imbued with a profound, almost sorrowful gravity. They saw a face, pale and sculptural in the harsh light, with eyes that looked through them, beyond them, as if gazing at the slow, inevitable march of time itself. He was not a model. He was a piece of living art. He was a walking poem. The dress was not a dress on a man. It was a garment on a figure who transcended gender, a timeless form embodying the soul of his daughter's collection. He reached the end of the runway, the blinding flash of 100 cameras creating a silent, strobing lightning storm. He paused for that single, perfect beat. He executed the slow, unwinding turn, the green silk swirling around him like a final, breathtaking brushstroke. He walked back, his pace unchanged, his expression serene. He disappeared once more into the darkness from which he came. For a long, drawn-out moment after David disappeared from the runway, there was absolute, profound silence. The cello music faded, leaving a vacuum. The audience, comprised of the most jaded, cynical, and world-weary people in the fashion industry, was collectively stunned. They were processing what they had just witnessed. It was not what anyone had expected. Then, a single person stood up. It was Antoine Dubois, Sarah's bitter rival, the man who had tried to sabotage her show. He was standing in the front row, his face a mask of disbelief and, strangely, a kind of awestruck reverence. He began to clap, a slow, deliberate, and resonant sound in the silent room. It was as if a spell had been broken. A second person stood. Then a third. And then, in a single, explosive wave, the entire auditorium rose to its feet. The silence was shattered by a deafening roar of applause, of shouts of bravo, of a wild, unrestrained, and emotional ovation that was unlike anything the seasoned veterans of Fashion Week had ever heard. This wasn't polite, industry applause. This was a raw, visceral, and deeply felt reaction. Backstage, the team was watching on the monitor, their faces streaked with tears. They were hugging each other, sobbing with relief and a joy so intense it was painful. Sarah stood frozen, her hand over her mouth, listening to the thunderous applause that was still going, wave after wave. She hadn't been made a laughingstock. She hadn't ended her career. She had, in that single, insane, desperate gamble, done something extraordinary. She had made the world feel something. It was tradition for the designer to take a brief walk down the runway at the end of the show. A stagehand gently nudged her. "Sarah, They're waiting for you." Numbly, she walked out into the blinding light. The roar of the crowd intensified. She looked out at the sea of standing, cheering faces, the flashing cameras, and she felt a wave of dizziness. She walked to the end of the runway, gave a small, overwhelmed bow, and then, in a move that broke all protocol, she turned back towards the entrance and held out her hand. "Dad," she mouthed, her voice lost in the noise. From the darkness, David emerged once more. He was still in character, his face the serene, timeless mask. He walked to his daughter's side. He took her outstretched hand, not as a father, but as her muse. They stood there together, the creator and the creation, a silent, powerful tableau. The crowd went even wilder. They took one final bow and then retreated backstage. The moment they were out of sight, the mask dropped. David was just a tired, 62-year-old man again. Sarah threw her arms around him, burying her face in the cool silk of his dress. "We did it," she sobbed. "We actually did it." The backstage area was instantly flooded. Bloggers, journalists, even rival designers were pushing their way in, desperate to get a quote, a picture, a piece of the story. It was a chaotic, celebratory mob. In the middle of it all, Antoine Dubois, his face pale, pushed his way through the crowd to Sarah. "I don't know how you did it, Weatherby," he said, his voice a mixture of awe and defeat. "But it was genius. Pure, absolute genius." David, feeling overwhelmed by the noise and the crush of people, quietly slipped back into his private dressing area. He sank onto the stool, the adrenaline finally beginning to fade, replaced by a bone-deep weariness. He had walked through the storm. Now, all he wanted was a quiet cup of tea. Saying he would stay was one thing, navigating the reality of it was another. David's life, once a quiet monologue, was now a loud, multilingual conversation he was struggling to follow. Sarah's agent, a formidable woman named Genevieve, immediately took charge of the Muse's career. His first official engagement was a photo shoot for the cover of a major international style magazine. The location was a vast, stark white photo studio that felt more like a laboratory than a creative space. He was introduced to a world-famous photographer, a man with a severe haircut who spoke only in monosyllables. David arrived in his usual attire, comfortable trousers and a sweater. He was immediately whisked into wardrobe and makeup. The process was familiar now, but no less surreal. The slicked-back hair, the neutral, sculptural makeup. But this time, the clothes weren't Sarah's. The stylist, a young, nervous man, presented him with an array of high-fashion garments from various designers. He was put in a pair of wide-legged, flowing black trousers and a dramatic, high-collared white shirt with voluminous sleeves. The clothes were strange, architectural, and surprisingly comfortable. They felt like Sarah's dress, like they belonged to no specific gender. On set, the photographer began to shout instructions. "Give me anger. Give me sorrow. Give me nothing." The commands were abstract, nonsensical to David's practical mind. How does one give nothing? He tried to replicate the calm, distant gaze from the runway, but the photographer was unimpressed. No. Boring. That is a man in a shirt. I need the story." Frustrated and feeling foolish, David stopped trying to be a model. He just stood there, letting his exhaustion and bewilderment show. He thought of his quiet home, of his late wife, and a profound wave of melancholy washed over his face. "Yes, that," the photographer suddenly screamed, the camera clicking furiously. "Hold that. The grief. The history. It is magnificent." David realized, in a moment of stunning clarity, that his greatest asset in this strange new world was not his ability to perform. It was his inability to. His authenticity, his complete lack of a model's practiced artifice, was what they wanted. His genuine weariness was their sorrow. His quiet dignity was their power. His life experience was their story. He began to understand the language. It wasn't about pretending to be someone else. It was about allowing the camera to see the person he already was, stripped of all context. The shoot lasted for 8 grueling hours. He was contorted into strange poses, blasted with wind machines, and forced to stare into bright lights until his eyes watered. By the end, he was more exhausted than he had ever been after a full week of teaching. He returned to the apartment late that night to find Sarah waiting up for him, a plate of food saved. "How was it?" she asked, her voice filled with a hint of worry. "Baffling," he said, sinking into a chair with a groan. "And strangely interesting." He had spent the day being looked at, not as a father, not as a teacher, but as a collection of shapes and shadows and emotions. He had been an object, a piece of art. And for a man who had spent his life appreciating the past, the novel experience of being captured in a single, timeless moment was unsettling, but also undeniably compelling. He was learning that there was more than one way to tell a story. The magazine cover was a sensation. The photograph they chose was a stark, black-and-white close-up of David's face. It was a landscape of lines and shadows, his expression one of profound, weary wisdom. It was the face of the Muse. It was also the face of a grieving widower and a retired teacher. The world saw art. He saw a man who missed his wife. The success created a strange duality in his life. By day, he was David, Sarah's father. He would make them both coffee in the morning, read his history books, and take long, anonymous walks through the streets of Paris, a quiet, unassuming tourist. But on other days, he was the Muse. He would be whisked away in a black car to a photo shoot or a fitting. He would step into a studio, and the transformation would begin. The makeup, the hair, the designer clothes. David would recede, and the silent, enigmatic figure would emerge. The dynamic with his daughter shifted in subtle, complex ways. She was still his child, the girl he had taught to ride a bike. But she was also, in this new context, his boss. She would attend his shoots, not as a daughter, but as a brand manager, conferring with the photographers and stylists, fiercely protective of the aesthetic they had created. "The lighting is too harsh," he heard her argue with a photographer one afternoon. "It's making him look severe." The Muse is not severe. He is serene. He found a quiet amusement in it. He, who had once edited her childhood essays, was now having his brand edited by her. The role reversal was dizzying. It was not without its conflicts. One evening, Genevieve, the agent, came to the apartment with a contract. It was the lucrative offer from the Japanese cosmetics company. "It's a fantastic deal," David, Genevieve said, her tone bright and persuasive. "All you have to do is a single television commercial and a few print ads." David read the contract. Then he looked at the product, an anti-aging cream for men. "They want to sell an anti-aging cream using my 62-year-old face," he asked, a wry smile on his lips. "Isn't that a bit of a contradiction?" "It's not about wrinkles, Dad," Sarah interjected in her brand manager voice. "It's about the story. Timelessness. Dignity." "The ad copy says it erases the damages of time," David read from the papers. "I've spent a lifetime accumulating the damages of time. They're called a life. I'm not going to help someone sell the idea that they should be erased." He closed the folder. "I won't do it." Genevieve and Sarah were stunned. It was a fortune. "Dad, think about what this money could do for you." Sarah protested. "You could buy your house back. You could travel. You could do anything you want." "I already have everything I want," he said quietly. He was no longer the desperate man who had needed a purpose. He had found one in helping his daughter. But he would not sell the very thing that made him valuable, his authenticity. The Muse was not for sale. Later, after Genevieve had left in a huff, Sarah came to him. "You were right," she said softly. "I'm sorry. I got caught up in the business of it all. I forgot about the art." "It's all right," he said. "We're both learning." They were navigating a new relationship, not just as father and daughter, but as partners in a strange, unexpected creative enterprise. He was the silent face, and she was the brilliant voice. And together, they were telling a story that was more compelling than either of them could have imagined. A few months into his new, bizarre life, David received an unexpected email. It was from Antoine Dubois, Sarah's rival. The tone was formal and surprisingly respectful. It was an invitation to have coffee. David showed it to Sarah, expecting her to be suspicious. "You should go," she said immediately, a new, quiet confidence in her voice. In our world, sometimes you have to sit down with your enemies. It's how you know you've won. They met in a small, quiet cafe near the Jardin du Luxembourg. Antoine, away from the preening peacockry of the fashion world, seemed like a different man. He was older than David had realized, with tired eyes that held no trace of his former animosity. "Mr. Weatherby," Antoine began, stirring his espresso. "I owe you an apology. And an explanation. What I did to your daughter, trying to poach her models, was unprofessional and cruel. I have been in this industry a long time, and sometimes it makes you do ugly things to survive." David listened, saying nothing. He was a historian. He understood the desperation that drove men to conflict. "But that is not why I asked you here," Antoine continued. He looked at David, a genuine, unfeigned curiosity in his eyes. "I wanted to understand what you did on that runway. It changed the conversation. For a week, no one was talking about hemlines or color palettes. We were talking about art, about age, about what it means to be beautiful. You reminded a very cynical industry that fashion could still be transcendent." He gave a small, weary smile. "It was the most infuriating and the most inspiring thing I have seen in 20 years. He leaned forward. "So I must ask, who are you? Are you a performance artist? A retired actor? How did you become that?" David considered the question. He thought of the frantic, panicked phone call from his daughter, of the absurd idea born of pure desperation, of the grueling lessons in walking and standing. "I am a retired history teacher," David said simply. "And a father. That's all." Antoine stared at him, searching for some hidden irony, but found none. The simple, unadorned truth was, in its own way, more shocking than any elaborate story. "A father," Antoine repeated softly, a look of profound understanding dawning on his face. "Of course. That explains it." After their coffee, they walked for a while in the Jardin du Luxembourg. They didn't talk about fashion. They talked about history, about books, about the quiet passage of time. They were just two older men, walking in a park. As they were about to part ways, Antoine turned to him. "Your wife, Helen, the artist. Sarah speaks of her often. She must have been a remarkable woman." A gentle, sad smile touched David's lips. "She was," he said quietly. "She was the real artist. She would have loved all of this. The drama, the beauty, the absurdity. She would have found it all incredibly funny." Walking back to the apartment, David felt a sense of peace he hadn't realized he'd been missing. He had faced his daughter's nemesis and found not an enemy, but a man. He had been seen not as the Muse, but as a husband who missed his wife. The world could have its icon, its symbol of timeless grace. He was beginning to understand that the character he played on the runway wasn't a fiction. The Muse's story, the quiet strength, the profound sense of history, the deep well of sadness and love in his eyes, it was not a performance. It was just the truth. It was Helen's memory, living on in him. A year after that first, frantic phone call, David stood once again in the chaotic backstage of a Paris Fashion Week show. It was the launch of Sarah's second collection. This time, there was no panic, no desperation. The atmosphere was one of quiet, confident authority. She was no longer an up-and-coming designer, she was a star. Her new collection was inspired by the quiet dignity of her father, filled with strong, clean lines, luxurious but understated fabrics, and an aesthetic that was both timeless and utterly modern. And once again, the final look was reserved for him. He sat in his private dressing area, the process now a familiar, meditative ritual. Jean-Luc applied the makeup, the same sculptural, neutral look that had become his signature. Cosette and Sarah dressed him in the final garment. It was a long, sweeping coat of the softest gray cashmere, worn over simple black silk trousers and a matching shirt. It was a garment of profound, simple elegance. He was not the sensational surprise of last year. He was now an institution, an expected and revered part of the Sarah Weatherby brand. As he waited in the wings, a young, nervous male model approached him. "Monsieur Weatherby," the young man said, his voice filled with awe. "I just wanted to say, it is an honor to be in the same show as you." David looked at the boy, he couldn't have been more than 18, and gave him a small, kind smile. "The honor is all mine," he said. "Just remember to breathe." When it was his turn, he stepped from the darkness into the light. The haunting cello music from the first show began to play, a deliberate, powerful callback. A hush fell over the crowd. He walked with the same slow, deliberate grace, the gray cashmere coat flowing behind him. He was the king, the senator, the historian. He was the muse. But this time, it felt different. It was no longer a role he was playing out of necessity. It was a part of him. A quiet, powerful truth he had discovered about himself. He reached the end of the runway, paused, and made his slow, unwinding turn. As he walked back, he let his gaze drift for a single, fleeting second, something he had never done before. He looked out at the sea of faces and found his daughters, watching from the wings. Her face was not filled with anxiety, but with a calm, beaming pride. Their eyes met. In that single, silent moment, the entire, insane, beautiful journey came full circle. He had come to Paris to save her, to give her the strength to stand on her own. And in doing so, she had saved him from a quiet, gray life and given him a world he could never have imagined. She had given him a new way to feel, to see, to be. He disappeared into the darkness. After the show, after the applause and the accolades, he found Sarah in the now quiet studio. She was packing up her sketches. "It was a beautiful show, Sarah," he said. "We make a good team," she replied, smiling. She looked at him, her father, her muse. "So, what's next for you? Another magazine cover? A trip to Tokyo for that campaign?" David thought for a moment. He thought of the quiet life, of his books and his armchair. He still missed it. But it was no longer the only world he belonged to. "Actually," he said, a new, gentle light in his eyes, "I was thinking of taking a class. At the Sorbonne. There's a visiting professor giving a lecture series on the late Roman Empire. I've always wanted to learn more about it." Sarah laughed, a sound of pure, uncomplicated joy. It was the most wonderfully, perfectly dad thing he could have said. He was still the history teacher. He was still the father. He was also the muse. He had finally learned that he didn't have to choose. His world hadn't shrunk or grown. It had simply finally become whole.